Hey, I know it's been a while, but I wanted to come to you and talk to you about my thoughts on what is going on right now in the United States and the world. And I wanted to put it all in the perspective of a speech by Malcolm X, and I'm going to show you the book that I am currently reading right now. I think it's so fitting to reread Malcolm X and the Black revolutionaries that both influenced him and that were influenced by him in the subsequent period after his assassination. It is such an interesting moment right now. The United States is facing an unprecedented crisis. The imperialist state is facing a crisis globally, not only because of its disastrous COVID-19 pandemic response, the economic crisis that was engineered because of it, and now the mass rebellion in the streets against police brutality and racist policing, but we also see that the global situation in the world is changing and that the world is looking east, is looking towards China, is looking towards countries that are not dedicated to just the unmitigated plunder of the world by multinational corporations and banks, which is what the United States is heavily invested in, but rather a world order that is characterized by peace, by environmental sustainability, and ultimately by the prosperity, not just for the tiny few rich folks who own property, but the entire world and the people that inhabit it. So I just first wanted to read something from Malcolm X. I'll show you the book right here. The book, it's a great book. Got it from a comrade in Boston years ago. Malcolm X speaks to young people, talks to young people. It's a series of speeches. The speeches range from his trips to Oxford University in Britain to his trips to Ghana and across the African continent later in his life. These are many of his speeches where you really see his revolutionary transformation and consciousness taking shape. So I'm just going to read you the beginning of a speech that he gave in Ghana on May 13th, 1964. And it's titled The Plight of 22 Million African Americans in the United States, or Afro-Americans, as he called them. So he said, I intend for my talk to be very informal because our position in America is an informal position. And I find it is very difficult to use formal terms to describe a very informal position. No condition of any people on earth is more deplorable than the condition or plight of 22 million black people in America. And our condition is so deplorable because we are in a country that professes to be a democracy and professes to be striving to give justice and freedom and equality to everyone who is born under its constitution. If we were born in South Africa or in Angola or in some part of this earth where they don't profess to be for freedom, that would be another thing. But when we are born in a country that stands up and represents itself as the leader of the free world, and you still have to beg and crawl just to get a chance to drink a cup of coffee, then the condition is very deplorable indeed. So tonight, so that you will understand me and why I speak as I do, it should probably be pointed out that at the outset I am not a politician. I don't know anything about politics. I'm from America, but I'm not an American. I didn't go there by my own free choice. If I were an American, there would be no problem. There'd be no need for legislation or civil rights or anything else. So I just try to face the fact as it actually is and come to this meeting as one of the victims of America, one of the victims of Americanism, one of the victims of democracy, one of the victims of a very hypocritical system that is going all over this earth today, representing itself to be qualified to tell other people how to run their country when they can't get the dirty things that are going on in their own country straightened out. So if someone else from America comes to you to speak, they're probably speaking as Americans. And they speak as people who see America through the eyes of Americans. And usually those types of persons refer to America or that which exists in America as the American dream. But for the 22 million of us in America who are of African descent, it is not an American dream, it is an American nightmare. So I thought it was fitting to start off this segment with that, just because of what we're seeing here across the United States. The rebellion against racist policing continues. Thousands of people continue to march in the streets. And we do see an interesting thing happening, though. We do see that the demands to defund the police and abolish the police are gaining traction in the corporate media, and you see it kind of hitting Main Street and mainstream. You see the consciousness rising around this and legitimate debates happening. But also, I think you see kind of a shift in politics, and this isn't necessarily negative, but there is a shift towards targeting the statues that are symbolic of white supremacy and colonialism. The American Indian movement in Boston, or I believe it was Minneapolis. It was one of those cities that took down the statue of Christopher Columbus. I actually think it was in Minnesota. And in Boston, I think the statue was beheaded. And you do see statues that represent this racist colonialist system that the United States is rooted in be targeted. And I think that is justified. I support it because I do believe that those monuments represent exactly what the United States is all about. And to take them down is a symbolic gesture that really does show a change in consciousness among the masses around the question of race and white supremacy in America. However, because those actions often are decoupled from the struggle for power and the struggle for a new world, to struggle for real material demands, we do see a sort of growing dichotomy where these symbolic acts are not necessarily being talked about, at least in the mainstream. Of course, I think that activists are having these conversations, but I do believe that in order for a real revolutionary moment to be built from this rebellion, there needs to be more of an effort among the leadership, right? Whoever they may be inside of this mass movement, to begin to make those connections between the racist and colonialist history of the United States and the demands that are being forwarded right now. And I think it has to go beyond defunding and abolishing the police and start talking about control and start talking about power. At Black Agenda Report, there's often articles, and last week is no different, where we talk about the community control of the police, what efforts are being done in places like Chicago, where people like Frank Chapman are organizing around the demand for community control of the police, where the Black is Back Coalition is organizing around the demand for community control of the police. That this demand is very important because it represents a step towards being able to control the institutions within a community that has been historically oppressed by this imperialist and white supremacist system. It is both a demand for self-determination and also a demand in the larger class struggle. A demand that necessarily means that not only is the oppressed community in question, the Black community, organized around their power, but also it leaves opportunity and room for real solidarity to emerge. And I think that is the direction that we need to go in. Of course, I'm not necessarily all-knowing here. I have participated in these kind of spontaneous struggles ever since the Occupy Wall Street movement and then the uprising that came about after Trayvon Martin was brutally killed. And ever since, I've been a part of these struggles. And I've noticed that, in part of these struggles and then also trying to join organizations, writing for Black Agenda Report, and also being involved in the labor movement and the anti-war movement at varying points, that oftentimes the organized formations that are building revolutionary movement, the class of people and folks, working class, Black working class, oppressed communities everywhere, and the spontaneous rebellion, they don't always seem to meet, right? And I think that there needs to be more efforts around that. And so I'm still very encouraged by the anger that I'm seeing and the progressive transformation and consciousness of so many people right now. It is truly heartening. I also want to give a shout out to those NBA players who are right now standing up against the NBA's desire to reopen, right? We are also amid a pandemic that all political parties, the entire ruling class, and all of its institutions have not only disastrously addressed in such a way that has killed so many people, disproportionately black. Over 110,000 people have died of this pandemic here in the United States. But also we know that the most disproportionately affected has been black people, has been oppressed communities, has been the exploited, has been the impoverished. And we also know that the U.S. has been waging a racist just vilification campaign against China, as well as against the rest of the world, increasing sanctions, threatening sanctions now against Hong Kong. We can get into that if we want, maybe in another video. Increasing sanctions against Iran during this pandemic. The criminal activity of the U.S. state, both domestically and abroad, is being exposed for all to see. We're also in a deep economic crisis. So all of these things together maybe spells doom for Donald Trump's re-election campaign. Who knows? Joe Biden would be the person to lose to him, just given Joe Biden's record, his inability to be articulate about any particular position, and just how antithetical his very being is to the oppressed and to the working class everywhere. But I think what matters most is not the electoral circus that's to come in November, and which this summer will be very interesting to see how this spontaneous movement becomes organized and how the forces of reaction begin to use their tools of adaptation, of co-optation, and of repression to generate energy for an electoral campaign during a pandemic, no less, rather than a movement for transformation socially and economically and politically, right? So we have a lot of different areas to look at here. And I don't like to do this, but I do want to make it just a quick plug. So on Twitter, I announced that I was going to send a PDF to anyone who donated to an organization right now in this struggle, this rebellion that is occurring right now in the United States. And so I just want to show you the book, okay? And I will do this, right? I'll put my email in the description. But the book is the book that Roberto Servent and I co-authored. It's American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News, from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. I believe that this book is very relevant right now. We really wrote it in the spirit of the ideological struggle, right? What Malcolm X was talking about in that speech, Americanism, the American dream, this American exceptionalist ethos of the U.S. being a force for democracy, of a leader in the free world. All of that is really what encapsulates American exceptionalism. And we even have a chapter about the 2017 struggle in Charlottesville around the monument of Robert E. Lee that was forced to be taken down, or there was a rebellion, I should say, a protest to take it down, and there was a clash with the right wing. But in that, we saw this American exceptionalist ethos come out, and we saw over the course, especially during the Black Lives Matter movement and after it kind of disbanded, we saw that this narrative, right, of making America what it could be. The NFL started to join hands with Colin Kaepernick, despite the fact that the NFL repressed him and basically blackballed him out of the league. But then they started to co-opt his message and make it about Donald Trump. And then, there was this whole debate about, Robert E. Lee is a racist monument to the Civil War, to slavery, but how about George Washington, right? How about Thomas Jefferson? And even Donald Trump made overtures toward that. So I do just want to read a quick passage. I will get this to anyone who donates to an organization. I want to recommend a few. Okay, so Black Alliance for Peace, and I'll link them in the description. Black is Back Coalition, I'll link them in the description, as well as Black Agenda Report, because we do need media, we do need the ideological struggle. I believe that these three organizations and institutions should be donated to, and I will, for those who do, send me a screenshot of your donation, and I will send you my book through PDF, of course. Right now, it's just really hard to get to post offices with the pandemic. Don't have as many copies, and the publishers being ridiculous. So, or is just having a hard time. So, with the pandemic. So just, yes, please send me a screenshot and I'll send you the book by PDF. So I'm just going to read you a quick passage now from the book. And it's going to be about Hamilton, but really it's going to be about the founding fathers. And just sort of, I think it's so relevant to be able to combat this sinister ideology of American exceptionalism. And we know it's coming. We know that it's already here, right? The kneeling with the Democratic Party in the House as they introduce this legislation that's basically nothing, right? In the sense of giving any power or any material relief to black people and people terrorized by police. So we know that it's already here, the Kente cloth. This is very similar, and I want to just read real quick. So the veneration of the founding fathers is a crucial aspect of American exceptionalism. Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and the like have been canonized as the foremost representatives of the values of democracy, freedom, and liberty so often ascribed to the United States. Their critical role in the maintenance and expansion of white supremacy is rarely taught or remembered. The erasure of historical memory under the guide of American exceptionalism has created a hierarchy of slave owners that represent divergent yet related trends in American politics. This was evident in a Saturday Night Live sketch that awkwardly tried to contest Donald Trump's sarcastic statement that perhaps statues of Washington and Jefferson should be removed as well. In the contemporary context of Charlottesville, Washington and Jefferson are good, while Robert E. Lee and his Confederate allies are bad. More specifically, Washington and Jefferson are venerated as representatives of noble and sophisticated liberalism, in contrast to the barbaric conservatism of the Confederacy. The tendency to defend the Founding Fathers is racism by calling Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton mere products of their time is a paramount example of anti-blackness. By suggesting that everyone believed slavery was okay back then, we equate everyone and every white person. We equate everyone with every white elite person. But not only were there plenty of white abolitionists, both rich and poor, there were much, more importantly, all the slaves who were against slavery, slaves that waged numerous rebellions throughout the history of their enslavement. The typical product of their time argument totally erases slaves from our imagination, as if they themselves had no moral agency. They are, once again, pushed into what Franz Fanon called the zone of non-being, or what Saidiya Hartman calls the position of the unthought. Again, this is one of the perplexing things about Hamilton, so the very popular play that has taken every, especially white liberals' imagination by storm. So if the goal is to let people of color know that that this is their country too, and that the American story is also their story, the question must be asked: were you simply unable to find any person of color in the history of this country from its inception to today that could have driven this point home? Before we too quickly judge the creators of the musical, however, we must confront our own sinister practices of spreading the U.S. Founding Fathers propaganda. Why are these slave owners and white elite bankers presented as the nation's heroes, which children are raised to emulate? Are our imaginations that limited? Is our knowledge of history so whitewashed and our aspirations for social justice so contaminated that we have students celebrate the people who perpetuated state violence and oppression, not those who actively resisted it? What if we stopped telling children that they too can be the President of the United States? What if we instead taught them that they too can be like Ella Baker as Londa Robeson, or her husband Paul Robeson? They can be like Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper, W.E.B. Du Bois, Octavia Butler, Toni Morrison, George Washington's runaway slave Ona Judge, or even the 18th century revolutionary Quaker dwarf Benjamin Lay. What does it say about us and the stories we believe about our exceptional and innocent nation that we think it is noble to pursue a job as head of the imperial state? Indeed, if we're talking about monuments to white supremacy, we can add the office of the presidency to that list. As both the domestic and foreign policies of Barack Obama have shown, the office can serve as a monument to and enforcer of white supremacy, even with a person of color running it. White supremacy laid the foundations for the development of the U.S. and its subsequent growth into the largest capitalist and imperialist power the world has ever known. The ideology of American innocence has us admit deceptively that our country might be racist, but that our founding values and ideas will carry us forward. Ideas such as liberalism and conservatism and the Americans that uphold them are reflections of the dominant system of a given society. Such people, especially in the liberal sphere, are deceived into naively and innocently thinking that we can move past our brutal racism with the structures and ideology put into place by our nation's rulers. As Jody Bird points out, we can take down all the Lee, Jackson, Jefferson, Washington, Cook, and Columbus monuments that litter the cities and towns of this nation, but the structural intent behind them in the first place remains written onto this land. Those monuments, Bird continues, order space, naturalize possession and dispossession, and even in their absence, continue to produce the ownership of land as the only path to freedom. White supremacy thus remains alive and well in the genesis of Wall Street, the prison industrial complex, and the numerous channels of cultural reproduction such as the musical Hamilton. Those who have torn down Confederate monuments to white supremacy have hopefully begun a process where these monuments can be torn down too. So again, I will get you a PDF copy of this book if you donate to the organizations that I discussed: Black Agenda Report, Black Alliance for Peace, the Black is Back Coalition. But there's so many out there. I'm not going to discriminate if you donate to another one. Of course, feel free to donate whichever organization you think is right. If you decide to donate to an NGO like Red Cross or something, you're out. I'm not going to get you my book. Sorry. Honestly, there are nonprofits in this struggle that are not necessarily to be trusted or supported. So, of course, if it's one of those, we can have a conversation about it offhand. But, maybe one day I'll do a video too on the nonprofit industrial complex, its role. There's a great book, Black Awakening in Capitalist America by Robert Allen. Please read that book. Also read Insights. The revolution will not be funded, right? So there are so many good texts about this struggle, and we saw in Ferguson just how critical the nonprofit industrial complex was in helping to subvert that rebellion. So, what I talked about in that chapter especially is the liberal co-optation, is the genesis of repression, not only in the state as we see it now with the police brutalizing protesters, killing black people, targeting journalists, all of the egregious human rights violations that we see occurring right now in the United States. That is one form of repression, but then there's the other ideological repression and war that is part of this struggle, and we are seeing it pretty outwardly right now with the corporations and the local governments and the Democratic Party with the kente cloth kneeling. All of that is part of this ideological war, a war of placation, the attempt to really steer the movement into acceptable means of protest. So that is a critical thing to remember. So please, if you're listening to this video and get anything out of it, it is that now is the time to actually increase our consciousness, our political education, but also a resolve in demanding the things that are being talked about right now out there, not just the abolition of the police, not just defunding the police, but all the demands that have come to the surface over the last few years, the economic demands and the political demands that we are seeing over the course of the few years gain traction, right? So now is the time to push this struggle more in the direction of solidarity, more in the direction of being steadfast in our positions and not allowing the Democratic Party, its nonprofits, or any force that aligns with the ruling class and their police protectors to stymie, stifle, and ultimately suffocate this movement into submission, right? We talk a lot about at Black Agenda Report, the graveyard of social movements that the Democratic Party creates, whether it's the labor movement, the environmentalist movement, we can go down the line, the immigrant rights movement. All of these movements have in some form been absorbed by the Democratic Party. The Black Lives Matter movement we even saw in 2014, 15, have issues with the Democratic Party, and some sections of it did become absorbed by the Democratic Party. So we need to learn these lessons, right? We cannot align with imperialists, and we have to build solidarity. And one critical opportunity right now in building solidarity is, as the corporate media is saying, oh, Iran and China and adversaries to the United States are trying to take advantage of this and exploit it just because they're reporting it and talking about it, concerned about it, right? And regardless of whether you think it's a geopolitical opportunist thing to do, if we don't align with these countries, the international arena is the most powerful arena of struggle, right? If we're going to have a revolutionary movement in the United States, it's going to have to be an internationalist movement. So, Black revolutionaries like Malcolm X understood this. He called for the United Nations to basically create a plebiscite for the Black community in the United States to be protected under international law and to form its own nation. That was one of his demands. He didn't get that out of nowhere, though. In the 1950s and 40s, late 1940s and early 1950s, there were plenty of activists: Claudia Jones, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, William Patterson, who also petitioned the United Nations in the We Charge Genocide petition. It's great. Please look that up. I'll try to link it in the channel as well. That also petitioned for the United Nations to come to the aid of the Black community, right? And so we're in this situation where the United States is declining as a world superpower. China is rising, and whatever you think about China, we have to acknowledge that China is not a militarist regime. It is not a regime based upon predatory imperialism. I guess you can have a debate about that with me if you want. But that's a conclusion I'm making based on how China has related with the rest of the world. So if we know that the world is moving in that direction, one of the ways we can leverage this struggle is by calling on the international community, quote unquote, but really call on the United Nations and call on those countries that are adversaries of the United States, right, to develop solidarity with them and to see what our common goals are. Because I think right now what needs to be acknowledged is that this Americanism that Malcolm X talks about, or the American exceptionalism that I talk about, that needs to be dropped by anyone who's serious about the struggle. And we need to begin to build relationships with anyone. Of course, Malcolm X said it. He'll build solidarity with anyone. He'll fight with anyone who is against these miserable conditions that we face on this earth. So we need to think about that globally as well, and to build relationships with folks and nations who are in solidarity with the struggle against racism, white supremacy, capitalism here in the United States, and are willing to use their international leverage to aid this struggle. I think, there are folks who are already doing that at the level of the United Nations. I believe that a strategic step forward would be then to call on nations who do have some power in the international realm, right? China is facing threats of sanctions. Even Russia, right, is facing the threat of the U.S. military, just like China is as well. If we can call on them, right, to step up, and also offer our words of support to their struggle, then maybe we can get somewhere here and really place the U.S. ruling class in a difficult position, right? Gerald Horne talks about in his great book, Counter-Revolution of 1776, that the colonists were really worried about the internal enemy and the external foe, right? So this idea that there were international competitors. At that time, it was colonial competitors, the Spanish, the French, and there were also slave rebellions happening. And so the combination of those two things left the colonies very vulnerable to subversion and possibly collapse. And so we need to start thinking about who are those external enemies of the United States that could be, they say an enemy might not be our friend. But I think in the United States, the consciousness isn't really there to make that determination anyway. So why not take that step forward, right? Why not take that step forward and see? That's what I've been trying to do in my own political consciousness raising, in my own political life, and my own dedication to the struggle, is trying to figure out how that can be done, okay? So that's why I talk a lot about Cuba. That's why I talk a lot about China, about Venezuela, about Vietnam. I'm going to link an article to Ho Chi Minh's 1924 speech that he gave at the Communist International, um, where he talked about lynching in the United States, right? He happened to work with Malcolm X as a worker here in the United States in Harlem. He also happened to travel the world with Marcus Garvey, Ho Chi Minh, all right? And I don't know if you can see my shirt. Sorry. You can see my shirt. Okay. So Ho Chi Minh, the first revolutionary president of Vietnam, the first real president of Vietnam after it was a colony, he really fleshed out what it meant to be an internationalist. And his writings are amazing. Check out his selected works. His speeches are online, Marxist.org. Ho Chi Minh is just one of those examples in just his life is one of those examples of the power of solidarity and what it can mean and what it can do. And a lot of black revolutionaries were heavily influenced by him, including one of my personal heroes, George Jackson, who often referred to the dragon, and that was a reference to Ho Chi Minh's poem that he wrote in prison himself in China. So in conclusion, I'm going to wrap this up because I've been here for a while. I think that we are in a very unprecedented moment. That's what Bernie Sanders says. That's what everyone is saying these days. But I think the opportunities are global in character and are far-reaching right now. But the dangers are also just as ominous and critical, right? This is truly a contradiction of global, class, and systemic proportions. And so I just hope that, as we learned in the Ferguson Rebellion and the Black Lives Matter struggle that occurred, that there's always going to be these tensions that exist between the mass movement, the spontaneity, and then the organizations that arise from that, as well as the organizations that come in from the establishment arena, the nonprofits, the Democratic Party, that those organizations are going to do their best to suffocate this movement, while our movement, our organizations must be prepared to arm people, right? And Black Agenda Report tries to do this ideologically, politically, in terms of education, in terms of what we need to know, arm people with what they need to get through that moment. So what comes out of this becomes more of an organized movement that can sustain real political struggle with this imperialist beast, rather than kind of dissipate as spontaneous movements often do, and then we're back at square one. Okay, so that's why I wanted to bring Malcolm X into this conversation. That's why I read that passage from the book, right? We have these monuments to white supremacy that just exist all around us. The power structure of the United States, its imperialist, capitalist, and racist character, is a monument to white supremacy itself. We talk about in our chapter in that book that I read, in our book that I read from, we talk about the fact that finance and real estate is basically rooted in the enslavement of Africans and black people, that black people were literally money, that they were both used as a financial instrument as well as property that could be profited from, and a free labor force that could be super exploited. So black people served two functions to enrich the slave owning and slave trading class. But then, also the prisons right now are a monument to white supremacy, in that they're very core reason for existing, or at least for proliferating as they did since the 1970s, was to stamp out the Black liberation movement, and was to ultimately take the capitalist system out of the crisis that it's in by putting black so-called disposable labor, mainly black disposable labor, inside of cages, so that it could be controlled and accounted for, rather than create an economic as well as a political revolutionary situation. So, all of these monuments to white supremacy, they exist, from the military to the police, to the president, to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. The entire system of the United States is predicated upon this white supremacist nightmare. But we do have to shed the American dream and the American exceptionalist ethos behind it. We do have to really shed the innocence that this country tries to impose upon us, this idea that the United States can be redeemed, and begin to think more like Malcolm X, to begin to think more like Du Bois, to begin to think more like Claudia Jones, Assata Shakur, to begin to think more like the revolutionary forefathers, for mothers and people before us, to chart a new course, right? And so, I hope this video was helpful. I'll try to come back again. Right now, we're in the works in trying to create a program with Margaret Kimberly for Black Agenda Report, and hopefully we can have that coming very soon. And this channel will change after that to be more focused on the Black Agenda Report program that in my description, the about page of this channel talks about, right? So this was all in preparation for that. So I'm hoping that's coming soon. So stay tuned. But all power to the people, and keep struggling and keep in these streets.